This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with Dr. Richard Elliott, the head of football studies at Southampton Solent University. He discusses the origin of the courses and their outstanding track record in the football industry, his research into player migration and how it can affect development pathways, as well as his current research into mental health issues in football. I hope you enjoy. Right, Richard, first of all, thank you for jumping on. And obviously our mutual friend / colleague, Graham Mills, put us in touch. Sounds like it could be really interesting. So I guess firstly, thank you for jumping on, and how are you?
I'm very, very well, thank you. And it's great to join you on the podcast.
Perfect. So obviously for those of you, people that don't know, could you just explain kind of a little bit about your background, what you're currently doing, and I guess how your paths crossed with Graham, really?
Yeah, so I'm currently head of football performance and participation at Solent University. So effectively that means I have ultimate responsibility for the roughly 400 students that we've got learning on our two football-specific degrees, but also on our professional education courses that we run in conjunction with the League Managers Association for staff at Premier League and Football League clubs, and also in conjunction with Kick It Out. I also have responsibility for all of the staff who work within the programme. I'm very fortunate to have an incredibly experienced and very talented group of staff, and Graham is one of those staff, and he and I sort of knew of each other, I guess, through football, and through some involvement that we had with Bournemouth Football Club over a number of years, and I was familiar with some of the work that he was doing. And then when we advertised for an A licensed coach that we needed a couple of years ago, we were very fortunate that Graham made an application, and he joined us on the programme, and he's done a great job, as all the staff do, and has made quite a significant contribution to the work that we do.
I guess before we dive into how exactly the programme came about and it's in its inception, etc., how are you guys finding the current circumstances? Obviously, I imagine it's presenting a lot of challenges for your learners and staff in terms of delivery and all that type of stuff. So how's that been as an institution trying to navigate those difficult times?
It's been tremendously difficult, and of course it's been tremendously difficult for everybody in all walks of life and in every conceivable different industry. Higher education is not immune, of course, to these kind of challenges, and in some ways I think we've felt it as bad, if not worse, than some other areas, because of the amount of uncertainty and of course, the way in which we work with so many hundreds, or in fact across the university, thousands of young people. So having their best interests in mind and doing what is right for them is obviously always at the front of our minds. The challenge that's sort of presented for us, particularly within a practical environment in which we're delivering education programs which are very much based for a lot of our students on the pitch, boots on, working with our coaching staff. Those challenges have been quite significant. We just haven't been able to do that from the start of this academic year. So we've been in a position where we've had to take some of the practical components of the degree courses and turn them into theoretically delivered modules. The coaching staff particularly done a brilliant job, I have to say, in regards to that, because they had to act quickly. They had to think with quite a significant amount of latitude, and they've had to sort of develop their practice in a way that they couldn't have predicted that they would have had to. So we've, I think, done a really, really good job in terms of transforming our curriculum from one which we are used to delivering face-to-face to one which has been delivered entirely online. And the good news is that the feedback that we've had from our students has been that they are overwhelmingly pleased with the experience that they're having. As one of the representatives said to me last week, he was amazed at how real it all feels. So that's the thing really for us. We wanted to try and replicate the campus-based experience remotely, and I think we've done that. It's been difficult because it's a massive learning curve for us as well as them, with Zoom initially, and then Microsoft Teams and various other bits of software and systems that we're integrating into our practice. Just the physical difficulties, if you want, of not being in a room with people, and the sort of the way in which that works in regards to cognitive processes and things like that. But I think that we had a really sort of well thought out series of structured processes that we moved through, and by pulling together as a team and adopting those processes and being sort of cohesive as a unit, I think what we delivered is excellent, and that would seem to be borne out through the feedback that we've had from the students.
So obviously, I know a lot of the work you do, as you said, will be practical. How have you gone about getting those modules online, and what does that look like if you've got any examples of it?
Yeah, so we already use an online learning platform called Solent Online Learning. It's a virtual learning environment. So we were already used to delivering a certain amount of our curriculum online, but the model that we always used pre-COVID was one in which there was the starting point was always either the classroom or the lecture theatre or the pitch, and that's where you would do a lot of the either the practically oriented stuff, which you would then follow up through additional support that would be provided via the virtual learning environment. The students were used to that, the staff were used to that, but the virtual learning environment only provided a relatively small amount, if you want, of additional support relative to that which was delivered physically in the classroom face-to-face or out on the pitch. What we've, of course, had to do is to move to a model in which there's absolutely zero physical in-classroom or on-pitch face-to-face currently, and in which we're delivering 100% through that virtual learning environment. What that's kind of meant for us is that we've had to learn very quickly the full extent of the functionality of the virtual learning environment, if you want. And I think a lot of the tutors, and I put myself in this category as well, a lot of us probably used maybe 20 to 30% of the functionality of the virtual learning environment, whereas now we're using far, far more. And one of the things I'd say, I'll go back to our team approach, is certainly I, as one of those users who used the VLE, but probably in a more basic format, my colleagues around me have been tremendously helpful in signposting me to certain functions that it has that I didn't know existed and things that it can do. And I think we've all kind of helped each other with that. And through our what we call our Learning Technologies Unit, LTU, the experts in that department have also helped us to understand what the system can do and how we can use it to best effect. So in terms of sort of the practically oriented stuff, what the tutors have been able to do is effectively rewrite the curriculum so that rather than delivering physically or demonstrating as they might have done on the pitch, they've been able to integrate a range of different resources, videos, session plans, practices, things such as that onto the virtual learning environment, and then allow the students in their own time to navigate their way through those with direction. What we've then done is, via Microsoft Teams, we've then incorporated a series of live seminars. So smaller groups of students who will meet live with a tutor to discuss in real time the aspect that they're currently studying in regards to that module. Effectively, the only thing that they haven't had in this first semester is the ability to lace up their boots and get out on the pitch. But otherwise, from a sort of a pedagogical perspective, if you want, from a teaching perspective, nothing has really changed. And the learning outcomes will be met in a similar way. They just won't quite have the same practical orientation that they would have had we been on campus.
So on the assumption that Obviously, some of them might be doing coaching or might be doing delivery and all that type of stuff. Is that something that you'll try and navigate back towards if stuff did die down a little bit?
Absolutely, that is the end game for us. If you want, that we need to get back out onto the pitch as soon as possible. I think whilst we can cope admirably in regards to the systems and processes that we've got, I don't think it's ever going to totally replace the ability to actually get out on the grass. So the sooner we can get the students back up to Test Park, which is our football centre, and we can actually get them out there and engaging in those practical activities, the better.
And then moving forwards, if COVID dies down and we're all in an ideal world, what will you keep from your current setup, and what would you and how would you integrate the practical setting? Because I imagine there's some work that you've put together and you think, actually, this probably works better than it did before.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's a piece of work that we've got ongoing at the moment. Because one of the things I think that we have realised in respect to being forced into this situation is that there are things that we do or have the capacity to do far better than we did before. So the use of the VLE now and the capacities that it has and the support that we can provide to students, that has increased enormously. And it would certainly be our intention moving forward now that even once we get back to a position in which we can get back down to the football centre and we can integrate the campus-based activities, we would still continue to support the students via the VLE at a level that we have already. I mean, for our first year students particularly, they don't know anything else. So that we sort of set the bar, if you want, for them. So if we were to go back to the sort of the lesser usage, if you want, of the VLE, it might feel like a backward step. So I think now that we've got the structures in place, now that we've got the framework, if you want, it's relatively easy for us now to maintain that framework with a few tweaks here and there post-COVID.
As you said, you are very well known within the football industry for your expertise and the number of people that go on to have successful employment within the industry. So I guess the first question for me is, how did it come about? How did it start from nothing to the point you are now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So Solent's first involvement in football education actually came in the mid to end 1990s. And anybody who knows anything about the history the recent history, if you want, of English football knows that after 1992 and the introduction of the Premier League, football transformed in England and, of course, all across Europe and other parts of the world as well. And there were some significant changes that occurred in football at that point in time. New media relationships, huge amounts of money were flooding into the game, and we began to see, if you want, the early, if you want, professionalisation of professional football. That might sound quite strange, but to those who were involved in the game, certainly, and have been involved in the game for a number of years, they will know that sort of pre-1990s. There were lots of aspects of professional football in England that weren't particularly professional, and therefore things were changing through a number of pre-existing relationships that existed with Southampton University way before I originally joined. There were some conversations were going on in respect to should we call it like administrative education between the League Managers Association and the university. And the representatives from the League Managers Association had been made aware of some existing education programs that the university was engaged in, which they thought might have some sort of value, if you want, for professional football clubs. Because these clubs were professionalising very rapidly, but as I say, a lot of the processes and the practices behind the scenes perhaps weren't keeping up with the level of development that was evident. So it was in the sort of mid to late 1990s that staff at the university started to have conversations with the LMA about developing a professional education course, effectively for football administrators, more specifically club secretaries. And if you know anything about sort of the internal workings of a professional football club, just like a company secretary in any business, the club secretary effectively is the person who organises pretty much everything. So their role can be very, very expansive, from booking travel and accommodation for the team to managing different functions within the football club, to player registration, admin regulation, all those sorts of things to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and all those sorts of things. The problem was that the role of club secretary and a number of other emerging administrative roles in football were not maybe as clearly defined as they might have been, and club secretaries didn't potentially or possibly have the kind of the level of understanding of the various functions of the football club that they might need to have. So in 1999, the university launched what was called the Certificate in Professional Sports Management and Administration Football. And that was effectively a year-long first-year undergraduate degree course for those individuals who were working in senior roles in football administration. To put it in simple terms, it was designed to help people run football clubs better, professional football clubs. To come onto the course, you had to be a member of one of the umbrella institutions under the LMA, so either a member of the Institute of Football Management Administration or the Professional Football Administrators Association. And you came onto the course, you effectively spent 2 years engaged in a program with us, and then by the end of it, you would be able to go back to your football club and run it more effectively. That was our first, if you want, entree into football education. And interestingly, some 21 years later, we still run that course today. And that is the course that is widely regarded as the industry standard for football administrators. And now, because football administration has expanded so rapidly and so widely, we get an incredibly broad range of learners come onto that course. We've had chief executives of pro clubs. We get academy managers. We get general administrators, all sorts of people who generally want to improve their prospects in regards to employment in professional football, but at the same time, they also want to learn how to run their football club better. That course had run successfully for a number of years. Professional football had continued to develop, and we started to have additional conversations with the professional game and various individuals within it who came back to the university and said, we've got another problem really in football now. The problem is that football has changed significantly. Football clubs have become businesses. And we're now in a position whereby walking into a football club and the first question you were asked is, so whose nephew are you then? Those days were kind of waning, and new roles were appearing in football, and clubs needed young, enthusiastic, motivated, highly trained and educated people to go into those roles, but they just didn't know where they were going to come from. And it was at that point that we started to think about whether or not there might be the possibility to actually develop undergraduate, full-scale, 3-year undergraduate degrees in football studies. And then, to my mind, nobody had done this before. So a degree that sort of encompassed every potential component of potential employment within football. So it was back in 2001, 2002, I was working at the university back then, that we sort of started to think about these football degrees. We launched the first football degree, BA Honours in Football Studies, in 2003, and then we subsequently launched a second BA Honours in what was at the time called Football Studies and Business in 2005. I remember distinctly in 2003, when the Football Studies launched, I was sat in my car listening to BBC Radio 2, I think it was, and the story that had broken was that how low could universities stoop, because somebody had just launched a degree in, as they referred to it, David Beckham studies. And this kind of discussion of Mickey Mouse courses and so on emerged, and I questioned at that point in time whether or not we'd done the right thing, and whether generally there was a market to support this. I needn't have worried, because now, some 17 years later, our model, if you want, in regards to football education has been replicated in various other places, both nationally and internationally. We've won European acclaim from UEFA for the project work that we do in the area of football development as part of the degrees. We've worked across the board with all of the major stakeholders in the game, and our research arm has changed Premier League rules and Football League regulations. We've trained staff from all of the major stakeholders right the way up to FIFA, and we've got over 100 of our graduates working full-time in Premier League and Football League clubs, some in some really quite senior roles now. So, so we came from nowhere to be almost everywhere, and I think that's something that makes all of us who work on the programme feel tremendously proud.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting story. I imagine, as you said there, the hearing that on the radio, you're kind of like, I'm not sure this is a good idea, but I think, that's people not giving something a chance, not necessarily liking change, but as you said, it seems like you're trying to make it more professional, which is, trying to make the football industry more professional and catch up to a certain degree within business. One thing that you said that really interested me there is that you had chief execs and stuff come on and to help them run the club more efficiently or think about the processes they have. How do you assist them in that? Because obviously they're in quite a senior role anyway. You'd like to think that many of them know kind of what they should be doing, at least. How does your course help them in that endeavour?
That's an interesting one, because certainly the higher level staff that we've worked with before, there's kind of a correlation with all of them. And all of them have come into their roles from outside of football. So it's we do try to do two things, I guess, in regards to the course. One is it's split into 6 modules, which focus on, if you want, 6 core components of football administration. So they stretch from the nuts and bolts of admin and regulation, and the rules and regulations that apply to the Premier League and EFL competitions. But also we look at things like football and ICT, and through that social media and so on, and the implications of that for football clubs, both in terms of marketing a football club, but also in terms of the destabilising effect that players and staff can have if they use social media irresponsibly. But we also have a separate module that looks specifically at the relationship between football and media, and the way in which clubs can use the media to their benefit, but again, also the way in which the media have to be managed effectively in order to build good relationships. But then we've also got those sort of structural components of law and of finance as well. So if you're coming into football from outside of football, whilst football clubs are businesses, and in some ways like any other business, because they still have to adhere to the same accounting regulations and a lot of the same legal requirements and all those sorts of things, they also operate, as you can imagine, as part of the entertainment industry, and therefore sometimes the ways in which certain roles within a football club are applied can be very different to other, dare I say, mainstream, if you want, businesses. So part of what we do is about kind of educating those people who come into football about the specific demands that football presents. But the second thing that we do as well is that it's about trying to provide this breadth. So if you come into a football club in a senior role, or sometimes in any role, you often have a very narrow view of the specific area that you've worked within. So a lot of chief execs, for example, will often come from finance backgrounds or legal backgrounds. So they're often very good at the law, they're very good at the finance, but maybe not so good at the stuff that relates to nuts and bolts regulation, or the stuff that relates to media. So the other thing that we try to do is to provide a sort of a broad-based education that captures as much of the complexity of the various departments of the club as possible. And one of the things that I've certainly found working on this program for many, many years is that the better clubs, the better professional clubs, are those that operate off of a model of joined up thinking. So I've seen some really good examples of clubs where the club is a cohesive unit and everybody understands their role, from the person that makes the tea at the training ground to the first team captain. Everybody understands the contribution that they make to the success of the club. I've also worked with some clubs that don't work that way at all and are a series of disparate components, often based in very different parts of the city, for example. So you've got a training ground, which is separate from a stadium staff, which is separate from administrative staff who are in our office building somewhere else. They don't really talk to one another. They don't really understand where they fit within the organisation. And as a consequence of that, you then see challenges emerging. So for us, it's also about, as I say, providing that breadth of understanding so that you have an appreciation of the various constituent components of the football club. And if you have those, then you're in a better position, in my opinion, to lead it.
And within the football clubs, would you say that the work that you do allows them to explore areas where they might need more help? The example I meant maybe used by that is the common accusation, if you like, chucked at someone like Ed Woodward, is that he's a businessman, he's not a football man or something like that, which you'll have some of that around the programme. You also have it the other way where you're a football man and not necessarily a businessman. Do you think going through your course help people understand that maybe, you know what, the legal stuff I really struggle with, so that might be a team member that I need to go and source from somewhere to assist me with that side? Is that a process that helps through your course?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually, because you used Ed Woodward as an example there, and now he or any other chief exec can't be expected to know absolutely everything about every single department. And I'm not suggesting, for example, if somebody comes in with a finance background, that we turn them into a lawyer, or we turn them into some form of football regulator, or we make them an expert in media. But what we do is give them a sensitivity to the challenges that exist within those various spheres. And I think that's the important thing, because again, to talk about good and bad practice that I've seen, you see some chief execs or senior people within football clubs who have a finite knowledge of a particular area, and they're great in that area, very, very good at managing the books, very, very good at making sure that player transfers from a legal perspective are tied up and there are no mistakes. But they don't really have a great deal of interest in other things. They let somebody else get on with that. Of course, when you work in that way, you have to put a significant amount of trust in those other people that they're doing their job right. If you don't have any knowledge of what they are or should be doing, then there has to be a significant amount of trust there. If you are at least sensitive to the challenges that they might face, if you are sensitive to the problems and the issues that exist as part of their daily work, then it can make you a more empathetic leader. You can speak to them and have some sort of understanding of the challenge that they might face, in the same way that they can have some sort of understanding of the challenge that you might face. It's really difficult in terms of that, in terms of football clubs, where you've got what we might refer to as the football and non-football side. So you've got, as we refer to it on the football degrees, we've got football studies, which is predominantly on pitch. So it produces coaches, it produces analysts, football development officers. And then we've got the football business management, as it's now called, which is predominantly off pitch or behind the scenes. So marketing, commercial, HR, these sorts of things. Again, I'll go back to my example that if you run a football club and those two things are seen as separate entities, I think you've probably got challenges. But if you've got a model in which the two are seen as being part of the same process, and you've got people who understand the demands of the football side relative to those who understand the off-pitch side, they don't have to know everything, but as long as they've got that sensitivity to the challenge, which they can then instill with a certain amount of trust as well. For me, that's what we're trying to create in terms of our our model. We're trying to create people who have a breadth of knowledge, not an expertise in everything, but a breadth of knowledge that provides them with a sensitivity to the challenges of the various departments, and recognise how those departments contribute to the whole.
Obviously, with you working on this course and overseeing this course, your breadth of knowledge is going to be quite big in terms of you're going to understand the coaching side all the way through to the legal side and stuff. Has it changed the way that you see football or football teams, or the way it's portrayed in the media? Because I mean, you see a lot now on social media, people will, get onto teams about different areas. Has it changed your interaction with football teams and looking for more underlying meanings of what's being said?
Unfortunately for me, I always get highlighted to the things that are wrong, because people want fixes. So my role is multi sort of faceted, if you want, because I've got the teaching side, but I've then also got the research and consultancy role that I also have. I mean, from the teaching perspective, and I'll go back to exactly what I just said about trust. You say that I've got this sort of breadth of knowledge. Actually, my knowledge is relatively finite. From a management perspective, I know exactly what is going on in the program. So, I work with all of the various staff in regards to sort of structural processes in the overall area, but it's up to them to run and deliver those areas. I've got 3 fantastic A licensed coaches who deliver for me. I've got a level 1. I'm not gonna be trotting out on the pitch at any time soon to try and do what they do. I did my level 1 to a certain extent because I wanted to have a greater awareness of coaching, but at the same time, I also wanted to just get a sense of what it's like to be a student at our football centre. So I did my level 1 with our students to get that sense of what it was like. But it's up to them to go out, put the boots on, and to deliver that, and I trust them to do that. Similarly, with the football development area, we've got 3 fantastic former football development officers who work within the football development area. And again, there are some connections between my work and football development, but I leave them to get on with that. Same with the psychologists. My work is largely around context, if you want. So my PhD is in sociology, but I studied at Loughborough, and my specific PhD research all related to elite sport, because I've been involved in elite sport for all of my adult life, if you want, and football for the last sort of 14, 15 years. But yeah, it's for me, it's about having that kind of breadth of knowledge, but being able to trust, if you want, the staff to be able to deliver within those specific areas.
Would running a football club interest you?
It's a good question. I think there's quite a lot of value that potentially I could add on the basis of the experience that I've got. Whether or not I would actually want to work within that environment, I'm not sure. As I say, I see a lot of the things, I get highlighted to a lot of the things that are wrong with football clubs. And interestingly, of course, I didn't answer your question there about how it's affected my relationship with football. There are things I absolutely love about football still, and I love being involved in the game all the way from the grassroots. Working with my son's team, all the way up to the work that I do with the professional clubs. But there are an awful lot of things in professional football that I don't like. And I don't think are I don't think are run well.
Like what?
I was just having a conversation yesterday with somebody very senior in the game about the challenge that money still presents, and I think COVID has highlighted that when you've got clubs that are laying off significant numbers of of staff, but at the same time are then spending billions of pounds in the transfer window. I think things such as that. I think some of the things that I see in regards to transition for academy players, and certainly in terms of the things that they go on and do after they've been released from clubs and the support that's available to them, I think there are challenges there. And my research at the moment predominantly relates to the relationship between football and mental illness. And I think that whilst change is coming, it's coming slowly, and there is still a huge amount of work that the professional game needs to do to support professional players and academy players in regards to their mental health.
Cool. So I guess this is quite a good time to pigeonhole into that and to turn your research into your PhD. So what exactly is it? What does it look like? I guess what are you currently learning, I guess?
So my sort of research background over the last probably near 20 years now has been in the area of elite sport and migration. So effectively, I look at the reasons why elite athletes leave one country to seek employment in another. The lived experiences, if you want, of foreign players. So what it's like to be a foreign player living and working in a foreign place, and then the effects of those foreign players, predominantly in terms of indigenous talent development. So many years ago, when I studied for my PhD, I was involved in a study that initially was looking at British basketball. I was a former basketball player, so I had a lot of connections in the game. And I used those as part of a study which was predominantly designed to look at the effects of the import of American migrants into British basketball and the effect that was having on indigenous talent development leading towards the London 2012 Olympics, because we were the host. London was the host city of the 2012 Olympics, of course. The GB basketball team qualified for the competition, something they'd never done before. But the concern was that there would not be a sustainable Olympic program because there weren't enough young British players playing in the British leagues, because all of the places were taken up by Americans. Now, you may already be making those kind of connections to similar sort of arguments that exist in English football and the number of foreign players that are employed in Premier League squads, for example, and the ways in which that potentially acts to the detriment of young English talent. So, I finished my PhD back in 2006 and came to Solent shortly thereafter, and effectively took the knowledge and the experience I had of working in one elite sport environment and started to apply it in football, and started to look at whether or not similar sorts of challenges existed in football. And firstly, I was kind of interested in why certain foreign players came to England. There's this misconception it's always about money. Money is one part of it, but in fact it's a much more complex picture. I was interested in what it was like being a foreign player living in England, and what the support mechanisms were like for foreign players. I was also interested in English players who went abroad and what it was like for them. And then, as I said, I was interested in this whole kind of context of whether or not foreign players and their involvement in the Premier League particularly did actually act to the detriment of young English talent. Did they block the developmental pathway? I was fortunate enough in 2008 to be commissioned by the Premier League to get involved in a project working with them, looking at some of the data that they held in regards to player registrations, but at the same time also engaging in a subsidiary project which looked at various aspects of the academy system at the time. Interestingly, when we reported on that after 18 months, a number of the things that we'd identified as challenges within the academy system were subsequently picked up. I don't think it was picked up because of our specific research, but they were picked up through supplementary work that was done as part of the research, which ultimately led to the introduction of the EPPP. So in some ways that was good, because we obviously had that validation that the things that we found and we thought were problematic, the Premier League had also identified as problematic and then had proposed solutions to. But my research over the last sort of few years, if you want, has developed very much along that kind of line. So I've worked with various teams and leagues across Europe. So I've looked at things like the ways in which migrants are recruited through networks in the Norwegian top league. I've worked with ex-Premier League players who have gone to various leagues across Europe to establish what it's like for them moving out of England and moving into other places. I've worked with a number of other leagues and teams in regards to projects that look at the lived experiences of migrants in particular places, and that's kind of then led me to my most recent research, which is this research which kind of connects migration to the concept of mental health. I worked with a former Premier League and Serie A player a few years ago. He's a good friend of mine, a guy called Vincent Perricard. Vincent originally grew up playing in the academy of Saint-Étienne in France. He subsequently was signed by Juventus and made his debut for Juventus against Arsenal in the Champions League. For one reason or another, his career at Juventus didn't work out, and he ended up being transferred to Portsmouth, who were subsequently promoted during his time there to the Premier League. He then left Portsmouth and was transferred to Stoke and was promoted to the Premier League with them as well. But behind the scenes, what people didn't know is that Vincent was suffering from depression, and arguably the depression was brought on by the conditions of his employment, particularly in England. And one of the things that we know about sort of research in this area is that elite sports environments can actually create the conditions for the development of mental illness. And this was something that I wanted to explore with Vincent, where he and I have known each other for more than a decade. And he was a really interesting case study. And I spent 8 years effectively with him, working on various different programs and interviewing him about his experience as a professional athlete and the way in which football had contributed to the deterioration of his mental health, which ultimately forced him out of the game at 28. And it was remarkable, the story, and also the way in which it wasn't just his story. It was the story of many young players who had not coped with the demands, if you want, of living in a foreign place, but also working in a particular elite sports environment. The paper that I've written in regards to that was actually just published a couple of months back. And I think there are sort of far-reaching consequences there for professional football. I've got a number of other projects ongoing at the moment, specifically looking, for example, at the effect that international transfers have on the potential risk to mental illness. And I think that's kind of the area that I'm most interested in at the moment, because I think this is an area which is really important for professional football clubs. Some clubs are beginning to do more in this area, lots are not. But I don't think the professional game as a whole recognises the scale of the problem that could potentially exist at the moment. And it doesn't actually take a huge amount of effort. It won't take a huge amount of effort to significantly change things, but it will take some different ways of thinking for the game. And that's kind of one of the key things, if you want, from my research, is that doing research is great, it's interesting, but at the same time it's got to have impact. And for me, I think if I can make a positive contribution to the number of cases of mental illness in professional football, then that will be the ultimate, if you want, test of whether or not my research has been successful.
Okay, so the first thing, if people wanted to go and find that research, where could they do it? Because I think obviously this is an important topic and also sounds like an interesting topic which people within a football background would want to know. So if they wanted to find it, where could they find it?
Well, the obvious thing to do is simple Google search to start with. The full paper people have to pay for, but fortunately the way that we work in universities nowadays means that the draft versions, for example, have to be made available free, so people can get hold of it via the university. So the best thing to do is if they just type into Google Richard Elliott football, I'll ping up. They can click on any number of links on there. Probably the best one is to click on my staff profile. It's listed on there. They'll see the full title of the paper, and from that they'll be able to then do another Google image search or be able to find it, and they can access it, download it, and do whatever they want with it from there on.
Perfect. And then the next question is, what factors or what key factors did you find out were, I guess, real triggers for that kind of mental health issues?
In Vincent's case, it was firstly it was the conditions of his migration. So the reason why he transferred, he became embroiled in a situation which I won't go into now, but you can read about in regards to the paper. But yeah, he became embroiled in a situation with one of the club's directors. So effectively, he was forced to leave Juventus when he didn't want to. And one thing that we know about migration is that forced migration often leads to worse outcomes than voluntary migration, because it often happens quickly, you don't have any control over it, and you can often, in a football context, you can end up somewhere where you've not chosen to be. So that was the first thing. The second thing is his physical transfer was not managed well. So he arrived in England, and the club to whom he transferred provided very, very little support to him. He didn't speak a word of English. He wasn't provided with an English tutor, and that's a massive thing for foreign players. If you can't speak the language, it makes life very, very difficult indeed. They didn't provide him with any accommodation, so they put him in a hotel where he lived for 4 months on his own, isolated. He's on his own, he's away from his family, he's away from his friends, he's in a foreign place, he doesn't speak the language. He wasn't guided in regards to the culture of English football, if you want, which is different from Italian football or French football where he'd been before. He wasn't guided financially. He was pretty much just left to get on. And of course, the problem is that for a player of Vincent's calibre who had been transferred from Juventus, he played in the Champions League, there was a very high expectation by his teammates and the fans. So when the depression began to get on top of him, and there were physical manifestations of that, it meant that he couldn't perform to the level that he was used to. He was suffering from bouts of fatigue. He didn't want to go to training in the morning. He wanted to lock himself away. So his performances deteriorated. Of course, as soon as his performances deteriorated, then the fans started getting on him. The media started getting on him. His teammates were getting on him. He wasn't making as many appearances. He was dropped to the bench. He was dropped out of the squad. All of these things then exacerbated the challenge that he was facing. And the biggest thing was he couldn't talk to anybody about it. This is one of the biggest challenges that exists within football, because there is a stigma attached to mental illness generally, but in elite football environments, that stigma is magnified. As he said, he couldn't go to the manager and say, "Look, I'm sorry, Gaffer, I'm not feeling very well. I'm feeling down. I need to see someone," because he felt that the risk was he'd be dropped, he wouldn't be re-signed, he wouldn't get a new contract, and then he's out the game, which ultimately happened anyway. And I think this is the fear for a lot of players within the game, is that they can't show any sort of weakness because they're afraid of the ramifications that might have. Because the manager's job is to win games. Every manager is potentially only 8 games away from sack. So, can he risk having a player in the dressing room that is not going to be able to perform, or who may be bringing other players down with him? I don't know. But there's just no time in football for these sorts of things, and clubs have not been great at providing anonymous, safe spaces for players to be able to go to and say, "Look, this is happening," without the fear of the repercussions that might occur. As I say, some clubs are doing that. Southampton, for example, are a club that have introduced or are beginning to introduce mechanisms to allow players to be able to talk about their mental illness, but it's still very hard. And it's very hard for men generally as well. If we're talking about young men here who, again, find it difficult to talk about their emotions. So there are a lot of things against football in the context of being able to talk about mental illness, but it's something that absolutely has to be raised as an issue, because otherwise we're going to lose other players. are going to lose their careers to this sort of thing. And then in the worst possible cases, you've got examples of players like Robert Enke in Germany who ultimately took his own life. So that's absolutely what we want to avoid in any circumstances possible.
I guess the first question is, why is this, or what is the issues around men addressing this type of thing? And then I guess leading on from that, is it in the industry, is there areas you think that we could improve just to help it even a little bit?
I think the first question that you probably need to ask a behavioural psychologist, because you're probably going back over thousands of years of the ways in which men's and women's brains have developed cognitively. What we do know is that the women are far, far better at talking about their emotions, at being open with one another, and there's certainly a huge amount of clinical evidence to suggest that's the case. Men are not very good at talking about their emotions. It's something to do with machismo. It's something to do with that idea of always having sort of a hard front, if you want. And in football, that's even more so. There is this concept of the hard front. So always presenting this kind of particular sort of work ethic, always showing sort of mental strength, if you want, psychological strength. So, football gets it even more so than sort of general life, if you want. And this is why there's a lot of evidence to suggest that elite athletes are more exposed to the likelihood of suffering from mental illness than members of the general population, simply because the kind of environments in which elite athletes work don't lend themselves to manifestations of weakness. We talk about the very opposite of that in elite sport. We talk about mental toughness. You have to be mentally tough to be able to deal with the challenges of being an elite athlete, the ups, the downs, winning, losing, playing, not playing, injury, retirement, all these kind of things. But in the context of mental illness, the two are not compatible. It's not compatible to show mental toughness, but at the same time be talking about mental weakness, which is what some people view mental illness as. To answer the second part of the question, in terms of what more can the clubs do, the recommendation that I made, or I have made currently in regards to the paper, is that clubs need to offer safe spaces with suitably qualified professionals within them, where players can go and talk about their mental health without the risk of stigmatisation that often goes with it. So in Vincent's case, for example, he was at Stoke City when he got introduced to a psychologist that was working with the club, a guy called John Duncan. And John was sort of had a client confidentiality clause, if you want, with players. So when a player went to spoke to him, he couldn't then go to the manager and say, look, this lad's come to me and I think he's got depression, so you might want to think about it in the context of your squad selection. He was there so that players could go and speak to him about challenges that they might be facing, and it could be a full range of different challenges. It could be performance-related psychology, but in Vincent's case, it was very much about, look, I'm having these problems, and this is the way they're affecting me. And very quickly, he was diagnosed as suffering from depression. Where Vincent was in his career at that point in time, it was too difficult, too late for him to be able to resurrect his career, and ultimately ended up leaving Stoke and falling out of the game not long after that. But if you ask Vincent about the importance of his relationship with John Duncan, he'll tell you that John saved his life, because Vincent had got to the stage where he was contemplating suicide, and whilst he never acted upon the thoughts that he was having, the risk is that had he not been introduced to somebody who he could talk to in confidence without risk of judgment, who knows what would have happened. So I think if clubs have got suitably qualified professionals that players can talk to, and they can be treated in confidence as well, away from the risk of stigmatisation or the effects it might have on their contract, then that is a good starting point. But that's not easy to do. I have to say, and quite how we would do that. Well, I haven't quite got that far in the research yet to sort of suggest how it could work. But clubs need to be aware of the challenges that elite sports and elite football environments present, the way they can manage those, and the systems and mechanisms they can put in place to protect the mental health of their employees.
Well, I mean, hopefully your research provides a bit of a turning point for that. I mean, we've had cases, as you said, Robert Enker there. You look at someone like Gary Speed a little bit later on who has similar issues. I know Clark Carlisle has been very forthcoming in terms of his struggles, which is good. For more, I'm trying to word this nicely, if you like, for more cynical fans who might turn around and say, what are they worried about? They get paid to run around a pitch and earn a load of money to do so. What would your response to that be?
Yeah, that's a really simple one. And that's that mental illness doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of wealth. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of gender. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of race. It can affect absolutely anybody. And it's interesting that you use that as an example, because I remember when I was working with Vincent, and he'd been interviewed by one of the daily newspapers. I think the headline they ran was something along the lines of, so now we're supposed to feel sorry for millionaire footballers. And, you know, it was really disappointing because the story completely discounted the fact that, you know, mental illness can affect anybody. In the same way that cancer can. You know, cancer doesn't discriminate. Rich people can get cancer, poor people can get cancer. It just doesn't matter. The bottom line is that we identify appropriate mechanisms by which to treat it. Because I think often fans don't have an awareness. There maybe is this naive perception that if you're earning 80 grand, 100 grand a week, that just must instantly make you happy. I don't think they understand the demands of what it is to be an elite athlete. I don't think they understand the pressure that comes with being an elite athlete. And more than anything else, I think often they lose sight of the fact that these are just men. And that man is someone's son, maybe someone's brother. It's often just daddy. And you know, when I've worked with players before with some stories I could tell you of players getting on top of fans getting on top of players, and then kids being bullied at school because dad's not, you know, performing on the pitch or whatever. And I think people lose sight of the fact that, you know, for all the hype and the money that they see for the Premier League players at the top, these are just men. And of course, the other thing I would say as well is that we tend to focus on the top. We tend to look at the Premier League, where the big salaries are, and for the biggest superstars, you know, they're celebrities and so on. But you've got to remember that those salaries and the bright lights, they fade very quickly as you come down the divisions. So, you know, the Championship is very different from the Premier League. Once you get to League One, League Two, you know, it's a hard grind for players who are in those kind of areas, and they've got all the additional concerns of paying the bills every month, and then realising that they've got a limited shelf life, and their career will, if they have a good career, will end at, you know, mid-30s, and then they're going to have to do something else. And what are they going to do? Maybe they haven't got a lot of education. So again, we almost come full circle, don't we? We come back to this kind of, how do you reinvent these individuals through education so that they can go on and achieve other things? It's very easy to focus on the top sort of few percent of those players who are genuine celebrities and earn enough within their careers that they'll never need to worry about money again. Even they are not immune from the risks of mental illness, but they are only a very small population relative to a much larger one, all of whom can be affected in the same way.
I think it's interesting. I know, obviously, I follow basketball relatively closely. I know Danny Green from the LA Lakers recently came out and said after his shooting performance, I think in Game 5, him and his girlfriend had death threats from LA fans saying obviously not good enough and stuff. And I understand fans' thing of going, yeah, it'd be lovely to have £80,000 a week and all that type of stuff, but probably the understanding of not realising you've also got 60,000 fans when you're away from home giving you a load of stick and stuff, and how that can affect you on top of all the other pressures that you're in a dressing room with 25 other people. You want to compete because you want to play. You're all looking for contracts, all that type of stuff. It's quite an interesting industry, and I think it's interesting that we're changing from maybe the be hard nosed, kind of don't talk about your problems, to now we're beginning to get to a stage where players are actually coming and talking about the difficulties they're having. I guess linking back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, which is the use of media, how do you think we could better use the media to support this type of action, or to kind of better give fans a better understanding? Because like, you go to that headline there, that's unhelpful for someone who's probably reached out, is low anyway, and he's thinking, actually, I'm going to trust someone to put my side across. This would be helpful. How could we better use the media to give players stories more accurately?
Yeah, I mean, the media is tremendously problematic, and not just in the context of mental illness, but a lot of other things. I immediately think about Raheem Sterling, for example, and the way in which he is or has been portrayed in the media, and the agenda that they are following. I also think about social media in the context of Danny Green. There, you're talking about the threats that he's had. The risks that social media present, and the ability that everybody seems to have a voice on social media. Everybody's voice is the loudest voice. Nobody agrees to disagree with anybody any longer. Everybody's right. And if you want to communicate with an elite athlete, be it a Premier League footballer or NBA star, you have a mechanism by which to do this now. You can do it via Twitter. You can contact people via different social networks and so on. And I think that's tremendously dangerous. I have a friend who's an ex-Premier League player who I know absolutely gets destroyed on social media still regularly. And he's not got anybody managing his social media accounts. He picks up his phone, he clicks on things, and he sees them, and he sees what people are saying about him, his family, his children, and all sorts of other things. And inevitably, that's gonna have an effect on people. If we're talking though about the larger scale, if you want, the kind of the mass media, it's a really tricky one because ultimately they are driven by circulation, in terms of getting people to buy their publications, or to look at their websites, or to watch their programs. So sometimes saying those kind of inflammatory things, that's what improves that circulation. They also are very good at attuning the climate of public opinion. So in that respect, they like telling people what to think, the media, and therefore if their agenda is that you shouldn't feel sorry for these Premier League players who earn £2 million plus on average a year, how can they possibly be sad? You have to go out to work every day on a building site or work in a hairdresser. How you shouldn't feel sorry for them, and we're going to do this sort of opinion piece on it to show you how we're right. It's difficult. I don't see a huge amount of responsible reporting in the media. A lot of it is, as I say, inflammatory. It's sensationalised. It's often inaccurate. You would kind of hope, perhaps, that it's up to the footballing authorities and the clubs, maybe, to do more to raise the profile of mental illness in a general sense, but also in regards to their own employees and playing staff. Football clubs, through their foundations and community departments, are very good at working with fans in regards to mental illness, particularly, again, guys, and men's health. Because, again, we know that beyond mental health, men are just generally really poor at going to the doctor and having things checked out relative to women. And I've worked on a couple of programs in football whereby football has been used as the anchor by which to get men to think more so about their health. But that's, the fans. When it comes to the players, maybe the clubs, maybe the stakeholders need to be doing more to raise awareness with the fans that these are still human beings, and they should be treated with respect, irrespective of how well they performed on a given Saturday, irrespective of whether or not you are fighting for a Champions League place where it looks like you're going to get relegated. Those guys need to be recognised for who they are, as opposed to being held up as some sort of always happy multi-millionaire who is looking down on everybody else simply because they've achieved something that millions of people would love to do, be a professional footballer, and they have done it, and others haven't.
I think I've got three really interesting bits to come into this. I don't know whether you saw it. I saw it floating around, funny enough, on social media a little while ago. But Roma actually did a recreation of a chance that one of their players missed with a fan. And you said, I can't believe he missed that thing. And you saw the guy do it and he fell over. And I thought it's brilliant because you got a guy who's on Twitter, I think, giving the fan, to be fair, giving the player, but this wasn't nasty, it was just how did he miss it type of thing, although it wasn't nasty. But in front of 40, 50,000 people, you kind of saw what the lights are, and you'd hope that would kind of rearrange his behaviour moving forward. But I thought that was quite a clever way of trying to say to their fans, listen, let's think about what you're actually saying, because you probably can't to a certain degree. Also, I think
I would say on that as well that Roma are absolutely brilliant with their social media and the way in which they work with it. They've got a very talented team, obviously, of people who work in that. They come up with these quite novel ways. But you're right, that's a really good way of saying, okay, you think you could do better? Well, let's see. And then it kind of shows others that maybe we need to think a little bit more carefully about what we say. If we want to think these things, okay, but maybe we keep them to ourselves, because it's easy to think that you could do better than the manager. It's easier to think that you could have finished from the edge of the 18-yard box when the player missed it, all these sorts of things. But the realities day to day are actually very different.
I also think a programme that I saw recently was Social Dilemma on Netflix, which I think is really interesting on this topic, how the apps and stuff have been creative. And one of the things that probably stood out to me was they feed you negative comments or negative articles because that's what you're more likely to engage with, things that you disagree with. So like you're saying there, in terms of newspapers running that headline, because it's automatically a negative, is something that will sell more papers. And I'd really encourage anyone to go and watch that Social Dilemma documentary, because I think that it really highlights some of the major issues with social media, from the people that created it saying that I now don't use it because it ropes me in. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, I have. And I think for me, it kind of highlighted just how dangerous social media can be. And I was going to make that point, actually, that you just made there, that it's interesting how many of the leading figures in regards to the invention of these social media platforms either do not themselves use them or do not allow their children to use them. And yet they rely, of course, on millions, if not billions, of young people worldwide for the revenues that these very platforms generate.
Yeah, I think if people haven't watched it, I definitely think it's something to go and have a look at, because I think it was really interesting to see the way that it does prompt and probe you to go onto a site and whatnot. And I guess the last thing, and this is a bit more of a positive, I guess, after the last two, which is I thought England going into the World Cup did a really good job with exposing the players to the media and the dialogue they had back and forth. And one of the things that I thought was really beneficial is that they had slightly longer interviews with the players. And it seemed like, in my personal opinion anyway, it began to humanise him a little more. Even someone like Fabian Delph, who went home for the birth of his child. So how do you think there's a place for players and coaches having slightly longer forms or longer interviews so that people get to know them rather than what they assume this player who's signed for £19 million from wherever looks like? Do you think that would be beneficial?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And like probably a lot of people listening, one of the things that I lose hours to in the evenings is I love going onto YouTube and then watching the kind of the behind the scenes type videos from clubs. So I've just been watching the Cycling GK, which is with Ben Foster, and it's just interesting. It's his own vlog that he does, and it's just interesting just seeing him just doing stuff, getting a sort of a sense for what it's like sort of behind the scenes. But I think that's tremendously powerful. Either players doing it themselves or their clubs doing it. When the clubs do it, it tends to be slightly more manicured, if you know what I mean. It's you can see that it's been produced in a particular kind of way. I quite like it when the players themselves, they're quite good. There was some, going back to the NBA, there was some great stuff that a player for the Lakers called JaVale McGee did from within the bubble, and it was just him with his mobile phone. It was like life within the bubble, which this is how terrible the food is they're trying to feed us. This is how lonely it is living in a hotel in Walt Disney World where we've been for the last sort of 3 months. His daughter that he hasn't seen for a couple of weeks turns up, and they try to have a day out. It's absolutely throwing it down with rain. All the usual kind of problems that I guess regular families have, but in this strange world in which elite athletes work. So I think those kind of things are really important because it gives fans, if you want, and it's sort of a bit of an insight into what it's like. Don't get me wrong, the players have to be really careful with this kind of stuff as well. So they need to make sure that they are, if they're the arbiter, if you want, of the content, they need to be sure that what is going out there does reflect them in the right way, and they're not coming off in a way that might actually work in a negative sense. But you're absolutely right though as well about England going into the last World Cup, because there was a lot of managing of expectations that went on through the FA, of course. There's a few things that went very well in regards to that program of activity. Firstly, England started to show the content from St George's Park in regards to the lead up for training, so you could see the players training, you could see them a little bit behind the scenes, you could get a little bit of sense for what it was like for them. But I think singly one of the most important things was the relationship that Gareth Southgate, the interviews that he did, and the relationships that he was able to build with England fans, and the way in which he acted as a conduit, if you want, between the team and the nation. And some of the things that he said that kind of positioned football, if you want, in respect to, he was talking about Brexit at one point in time, he was talking about other sort of social and economic challenges which were ongoing. I remember he was talking about race in the context of Raheem Sterling, and you might remember when the newspapers had focused on a tattoo that he had and his father, and was trying to, exactly as you say, was trying to bring out negative-based stories to generate a reaction. Gareth was very good, and I say Gareth, but I suspect the media team at the FA were very, very good at using Gareth as a media through which there could be a connection to nation. And a connection to the fans, and England went into, of course, that World Cup with probably one of the lowest expectations that they'd had for a long time. We used to go into every major tournament it was seen. It was the golden generation, and then before that it was something else. And if we don't win this, there's obviously something's gone wrong, and then you struggle to get out the group, or you're out in the second round again, or something like that. So of course, what a semi-final appearance was seen as a massive overachievement, even though I think the bookies probably had England getting to the quarters. But they came back, I think, as a team reinvented. And a lot of that came down to the way in which the FA's media team had managed the way in which the team were presented to England fans and the nation more broadly.
Yeah, and I think that being skillful in that area is definitely something that can be helpful. And I also think that I thought about it last night. Jurgen Klopp, I think on Tuesday, was a bit spiky in a press conference to one of the journalists and said something along the lines of, "Are you even a journalist?" And I thought about it and I was like, if that was Mourinho, for example, I think that would have got a lot of bad press. But because Klopp also has this side to him which is very jovial, he's friendly with fans, and that gets portrayed in the media, I think that actually he gets a free hit every now and again. Whereas Mourinho, it's almost like everyone's on their seat going, when's he going to go? When's he going to go? And I think that, there needs to be some care, I guess, on how people are portrayed. And I guess the big thing for me, particularly in kind of these longer form discussions or longer interviews, is if they're unedited or barely edited, most people in the world you'll find common ground with. So it might be someone like Raheem Sterling. I'll be honest, I'm not really familiar with his background, but it might be that you grow up in the same area as London as him, or I know he had challenges regarding his parents. It might be that, you came from a similar city, or you got some similar number of siblings or similar kids, and all of a sudden you go, oh, okay, there are differences in our life, but there are also aspects that are very similar as well. And I think that that's something that would hopefully challenge the social media behaviour. When you feel like you've got something in common with people, you're less likely to attack them.
Yes, I think, and I would agree with that. Of course, I think the challenge here is that with any form of celebrity, I think people seem to think that they know that person and they make judgments on the basis of what is presented to them in the media. And of course, what you've got to remember is that what's often presented in the media is mediated. It is somebody has chosen to edit that in a particular way. Somebody has chosen this photograph. Somebody has chosen this headline. And there's an agenda. And I don't think people recognise that. In the context of race in football, it's kind of really clear. You can often see the way in which players from black and minority ethnic backgrounds are presented in the media relative to white footballers. These things are sometimes based on racial profiling. They're sometimes based on institutional racism. They're often based on people just wanting to increase circulation. And of course, when somebody is presented in a particular way, somebody is trying to make you believe a particular person has a particular persona. So, if you think about it, I'll go back to an example from quite a few years ago, actually. But if you think about David Beckham, and if you go back to the I think it was the '98 World Cup, wasn't it, when he got sent off against Argentina, when I think it was Diego Simeone that he kicked out against. And before, he'd been a hero before then. David Beckham was the wonder kid, of course. But I remember the headline the following day, I think it was in the Daily Mirror, which was 10 brave lions, one stupid boy. And people were burning effigies of David Beckham in the street 24 hours later. And then, of course, he reinvented himself again. And very rarely do you ever see that happen. Use the example there of Jose Mourinho. Similar with Jose. He's a bit like a pantomime villain to a certain extent. I think people love him. Some people love to hate him. But he used to get away with quite a lot. But then after the incident at Chelsea, when he lost the dressing room, he lost his job there, I think then he seemed to lose some of the shine maybe that he had. Then he had that sort of barren period. He's never quite reinvented himself in the way that perhaps he would have liked to. But I still think there's an awful lot of people that have a soft spot for Jose Mourinho. But Jurgen Klopp you've absolutely kind of made the best example there. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to meet Jurgen, and he is in person the way he comes across when you see him in on the TV and other ways. He's incredibly personable. He makes you feel as if you've known him for many years, and he's very charming and he's very funny, and in my opinion, that is all very carefully crafted. A certain amount of it will be him, a certain amount of it will be his personality, but there's also a certain amount of it which I think will also be sort of a crafted persona that he knows works in terms of engaging in with fan groups. So if you look, for example, at the ways in which he manifested his relationships while he was at Dortmund, the man of the people, then, and you look at the way he is, you know, in Liverpool. I remember one of the first things he ever turned up to in Liverpool, he turned up wearing a Beatles t-shirt. I mean, you know, if you want to connect yourselves to the people of Liverpool, then you connect yourself to those things that are important to them. Obviously, it helps, you know, if you can win a title after 30 years as well. That's certainly going to endear you to them. But at the same time, he gets it. You know, he kind of understands the sort of the people's perspective, the fans' perspective, and that's why I think he manages himself, his persona, and so on in that way. And that's why, of course, you say he gets away with stuff. So I didn't see the particular example, but yeah, you know, he gets away with it. He can be prickly with a journalist, and people will, you know, won't go, oh, you know, Jurgen again, he's a miserable guy, or whatever. They'll let him get away with it because it's Jurgen, and he's got that big smile, and he's the man of the people.
No, I think it is very interesting the way it's used and the way people are personified, etc. Kind of looping back, because it's a question that I was going to ask and we've got sidetracked a little bit. If you had like a plan A, or A star example of how to take care of a player who's come across from a foreign country into a new league, a new setting, what would that look like?
So there has to be quite a lot of pre-planning. Let's assume it's a player at one of the top divisions, because that's going to be a very different relationship. The agent, for a start, is crucial. You know, agents, and again, you know, fans often don't recognise what agents do. Agents do get involved in the financial negotiations, the contractual negotiations for players' transfers, but they should also be effectively a very, very good PA. They should be managing that player's life to a certain extent to make sure that they don't have to worry about anything much other than playing football. So the club needs to be on point with the agent very early on to establish what the agent's going to do and what the club needs to do. It's then a series of, if you want, quite practical arrangements that need to be made. If a player is moving to a country, for example, in which they don't speak the language, then that's one of the first arrangements that need to be made for high intensity one-to-one language tutoring, so that they can pick up at the very least the basic football lingo, but then beyond that they are able to manage their life day to day. You know, it's remarkable how it's the little things that kind of make a difference to players. So, for example, it's things like mobile phone contracts. You know, can they sort that out so their mobile phone, they know their mobile phone's going to work effectively? Does their network provider provide roaming service when they're out? Do they need to get a new mobile? How do they do that? Which companies provide in a particular country? Where are they going to live? You know, can we sort this out so we're not staying in a hotel really quickly? You know, can they move straight into some form of accommodation? Is it close to the training ground? All this sort of stuff. Bank accounts. One of the biggest things for players is, how are they getting paid? Can it be paid into this account? How does that work from a tax perspective if it's going out of the country? Do I need to have an account in the UK? Communication with family and friends. Are they coming across? Can I bring my wife? Can I bring my children? What about schools? Where are my kids going to go to school? What the school's like? What's my wife going to do? Is there a network for my wife? Are there other players who come from the country I come from? Or, you know, for example, like Latin Americans. Are there other Latin Americans so that our wives can meet? It's all those kind of little things that make a massive difference. It's not even about once they get to the training ground and they get on the pitch. That for them is often where they find their solace. That's where they feel most at home. That's the easy part, if you want. It's all the other things. And let me just give you an example, actually, to go back to Jose Mourinho. I was at a dinner with Jose quite a few years ago now. He left Chelsea. So he was managing in Spain, and he was asked at this dinner and said, "Do you think you'd ever come back to Chelsea?" And at the point, he said, "I would love to, but I don't think it'll ever happen." And the person followed up and said, "Well, why?" And of course, I think most of the people in the room were expecting him to kind of say, "Oh, I've had my time at Chelsea now, a bigger club or something like that." Yeah, but he actually said, "I couldn't do it to my kids." He said, the reality of my life is that I move the kids every few years, and it's heartbreaking. I take them out of school, and they have to start again in a new school, in a new country, in a new place, sometimes in a new language. But more than that, it's watching them have to say goodbye to their friends. They've made these friends, and then they have to go and do it again, and then I take them away from those friends, and they make friends, and then they take them away from that. And he said it breaks my heart every time. Didn't obviously ultimately stop him going back to Chelsea eventually, but I just think it does kind of highlight, if you want, the kind of the ways in which these are just ordinary people in some ways. Jose Mourinho is the special one, and has this global profile in football, but he's also just daddy, and somebody who needs to be there for his kids and has to make good decisions in that respect. Those are the sorts of things that players worry about. It's all that kind of stuff, because the worst case scenarios are those like Vincent. Football transfers often happen very quickly. You don't often have a lot of time to prepare. So you end up in a foreign place. You literally turn up at the airport. There's no one there to meet you. You don't speak the language. Your mobile phone doesn't work. You haven't got a car. You don't know how to get about. You're in a hotel on your own, eating the same food every day. You don't know anybody. Those are the sorts of things that really worry the players, and that start to get on top of them. So if clubs can start to manage the little things more effectively, and some do. They have these new departments that are emerging in certainly Premier League clubs now, where you used to have the player liaison officer, but now you've got player care. And that, for me, is a massive growth area in football employment over the next probably 10, 15 years, player care. You just need to get the little things right. And I'll tell you one thing that a psychologist at a club said to me once. He said, it's absolutely ridiculous. Football players spend about 12% of their time actually within the club. The rest of the time they are off doing other things. And he said to me, it's ridiculous. You've got, it's like having a Rolls Royce that's cost you, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds, and you fill it with cooking oil and wonder why it doesn't go. And that kind of is the analogy, if you want, in regards to footballers. Clubs are paying tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of pounds for players, and then they're just not treating them with care. And, it just seems absolutely ridiculous, because then they wonder why they're not performing.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I've watched the Amazon Prime documentary about Tottenham, being a Spurs fan, and one of the interesting things linking to this is with Stephen Birdwin, the new winger that they signed. They have a complex where they try and encourage the players to go, at least in the short term. And one of the things they said, they went, so-and-so's on the floor below and the other players on the floor above. And until now, I hadn't really thought about it, but actually, what a great way of getting you to integrate with your teammates and have people to talk to and know what you're doing, because if you're not sure, you can go and ask. There are apartments where family and stuff can stay. So like one of the things that, because his family were there and they had like mum and dad and all that type of stuff, they went, we'd probably go for a 2-bed. That means we could come over and stay in the same room. And when I look back at it now, you go, actually, that's so simple from the club, but what a great way of doing it, because all of a sudden, a lot of those things where you're not having a chance to talk to family or you are isolated are being cared for in one place, and probably in a place where they can help as well. They've probably got people that on front desk that go, if you've got problems, let us know, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I'll give you if you want the antithesis to that. I'll give you an example of probably the worst case I've ever seen of this. I was working with a club. I won't say what club it was. It was a football league club in the Midlands, and I was staying at a hotel that was just across from the stadium the night before I went to go in and do this work with them, and it was during the transfer window, and I was stood at the reception desk checking out in the morning, and taxi pulled up outside of the hotel, and taxi driver comes in with a young lad. He's probably about 18, 19 years old. He's in a club tracksuit, so not the club that I'm at, another club tracksuit. So kind of figuring that he's been transferred, new player, didn't recognise him, I have to say. He looks a bit lost. The taxi driver points at the stadium and just says, "You there, training tomorrow," and then walks away. Gets back in the cab and drives off. So this lad sort of looks at the stadium and then just stands there. The woman behind the reception desk, who's sort of dealing with me, sort of looks up and says, "Are you okay there?" He points at his ear, in other words, to suggest I don't understand, I don't speak English. So she just says name. He gives his name. She's got a clipboard with a list of names on. She ticks him off. She's already got the keys all lined up behind. There's a few other young lads, I assume other players, sat already in the restaurant. She gives him a key. He leaves his bag where it is, and he just wanders off towards the room. I then say, I think he's left his bag here. I think he's expecting somebody to take his bag, which is not. So he gets called back. He takes his bag. He just wandered off. I never saw him again. And it just kind of thought, if that's this young lad's sort of arrival at an EFL club, and that's it. He's going to go into his room now. He is totally on his own. He's a young lad. He's totally on his own. He doesn't really know where he is. He clearly doesn't speak the language. He hasn't even been given the time to go to the stadium the next day. I'm not sure if he knows what he's going to do, but it just smacked to me of just poor organisation. And what's that young lad going to do? He's going to go and sit in his room, maybe put foreign TV on that he can't understand, sit in his bed, get his phone out, and text somebody and say, "I've arrived." And you kind of hope that the club would have done a bit more once he actually arrived in the stadium the following day to start piecing together his life in that place. But equally, you could imagine that it might well have been the case that Saturday he's in the squad, he's in front of 40,000 fans, and he's got to perform. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know who the people around him are. He's not sure what he's eating tonight or what he's going to do. So whilst there are some better examples nowadays, there are still also some very poor ones as well.
I think we also talk about first impressions, and it's just not a great first impression. You being left by yourself, it's not a great first impression.
No.
So listen, last topic before I let you go, because I appreciate running out of time, is you mentioned about the blocking of pathways, or potentially blocking pathways that your PhD came into, and you obviously noticed particularly in basketball, and then kind of linked into academies and stuff. What were your findings within that sector, and what did that look like?
In basketball, it was pretty clear that the recruitment of predominantly American players into British basketball was creating quite a significant problem. Young British players just weren't getting the opportunities at the highest possible levels. It even became sort of one stage worse than that, because American players were coming over and becoming dual nationals, or were dual nationals, or were becoming naturalised. So it got to the stage where people across Europe would say that the English or British basketball team was the only one in Europe that spoke with an American accent, simply because it was just full of Americans. So there was work to do there. The ultimate irony, I guess, was that sort of British team with American accents did represent Team GB at the Olympics in 2012. There were some good British players in there, I should say, but there were also a number of naturalised Americans as well. In the context of football, though, it's actually really interesting, because I think there is a misassumption that the involvement of foreign players blocks the developmental path for young English players. It's incredibly complicated. You've got to think if you're a first team manager and you need, for example, a fullback. Do you try to bring somebody in from the academy and blood them as such, to give them those minutes, give them that time to bring them into the squad? Or do you buy a ready-made foreign international who can come in and do a job for you probably straight away? If you're a club with money, for most managers, that's a no-brainer. And that's why you tend to find that it's the clubs that have less financial capability that tend to be those that are better at using their academy, because academies are there to do two things: produce players for the first team, or to sell on to generate income. And if you look at Southampton as a case, if you look at those players that have gone on now, I'm talking about your Shaws and your Lallanas and Kleins and so on, players like that. If you think about those guys, a lot of them made debuts in League One or in the Championship, when the club had a much greater reliance on its academy. The Chelseas, the Cities, the Liverpools, and so on, do they need to use the academy in the same sort of way when they've got the financial resources that they've got? Depends on the club. Liverpool have been very successful over the years. Other clubs rely far less on their academies. What we found though was really interesting in that we found that players were getting opportunities to make first team debuts if they were good enough. But almost more than that, what we found is that the general quality of young English players was improving because of their intermingling with foreign players. So we were specifically really looking at foreign players and academies. If you know anything about the regulations that stipulate the transfer of minors in football, so players under 18, there are quite strict regulations which mean that you can't always recruit a foreign player into an academy under 18. You can only do it if they're they come from an EU member state, if they come for non-footballing reasons, or there's another reason as well which escapes me at the moment. But there are still, when we were engaged in this study, there were quite a few foreign players who were playing in the academy system. But what we found is that there was this process of what we refer to actually as feet exchange. So let me give you a bit of background in this term. In the area of highly skilled migration, there is a concept called brain drain. So certain nations lose their most talented people because, for example, they can go elsewhere and earn far more.
Brazil, for example.
Yeah, I'm thinking in the context outside of football to start with. But outside of football, you've got this concept of brain drain. But you've also got this concept of brain exchange. So if you get lots of very talented people and they all end up being employed in similar sorts of places, then you get this circulation of skills and knowledge. We identified the same thing in football. And you're absolutely right. Brazil is the example there. So the best Brazilian players don't stay and play in Brazil. What they tend to do is come and play in the leading European leagues, and then at the end of their careers, they might go back and play for, a Brazilian team then. But what we found is that when these foreign players intermingled with the English players, there was this concept not of feet drain, which is the footballing equivalent of brain drain, but there was this concept of feet exchange that, in fact, the English players were learning quite a lot from the foreign players. And it was things like, for example, technical ability. So in the past, it's often been the case that English players have been criticised for their technical ability. So by that, I mean their relationship with the ball, if you want, in simple terms, relative to foreign players. So what we found, speaking to coaching staff and academy managers and directors, was that they would give us lots of different examples of the ways in which, by having the foreign players and the English players together, the English players were learning from the foreign players, and the foreign players were learning from the English players. So the English players were learning, those aspects of technical ability from being around the foreign players. And interestingly, the foreign players that they were learning to cope with the demands of the pace, particularly the Premier League, and the physical nature of it. So what you ended up with was this kind of accumulation of development, if you want, whereby all of these players kind of improved. And that kind of comes back to this kind of argument that in the old days, before we had significant numbers of foreign players drawn from the breadth of different places that they are now in the Premier League, as an example, then in training and matches every day, the best English players used to get tested against the best English players. Nowadays, in training and matches, they get tested against the best players from all around the world, some of the best players in the world. So what that's done is that's improved, I think, the standard of English players generally. And I think now, if you look at the English players who are really having an impact now in the Premier League, and in some cases in other parts of Europe, of course, as well. And then if you also look, for example, at the England national team, you see players who are more technically adept, but also able to cope with the demands of playing in what is one of the quickest and strongest leagues anywhere in Europe, if not the quickest and strongest league in Europe. So, in answer to your question, I still think there is a certain amount of blocking that occurs in the developmental path, but maybe only for certain sorts of clubs. But at the same time, the involvement of foreign players has significantly improved English football. And not just in terms of what happens on the pitch, but also in terms of their outlook. So if I go all the way back to the players like Gianfranco Zola, Gianluca Vialli, and so on, when players such as that joined Chelsea, you had a number of other high-profile foreign players who joined other teams in the Premier League. When they arrived back in the early 1990s, they came with a completely different perception of what football was. They brought their own S&C coaches. Before an S&C coach in England was a thing, they brought their own dietitians and nutritionists, which, again, before it was a thing. They did additional training, they lifted weights, they did all the things that footballers take for granted now, but which 25 years ago were an absolute mystery to the average English top league footballer, who was more used to, as Dennis Wise put it many years ago when he first met Gianfranco Zola, he was more used to 5 pints in the evening and then a full cooked breakfast before he went to training. So I think, football has moved a significant way in the last 25 to 30 years, and I think quite a lot of that movement has occurred as a result of the involvement of foreign players, but also coaches, managers, and even owners as well.
I think it's interesting because it goes against the narrative to a certain degree, where people say that it's a block pathway that players don't get through. But I think, highlighting the benefits of it, whilst there are obviously issues, the benefits is that we've actually seen. And I know I've read some literature, in particular some books, that talks about this knowledge share and why England were behind, saying where we broke away from kind of mainland Europe and they had a lot of knowledge share, we kind of did our own thing. And then for a long period of time, we were having to catch up. But I think at the moment in particular, everyone seems more open to go and investigate what everyone else is doing, both in sport and out of sport, which is good.
Yeah, and I think that you make a good point there, because we have been of island mentality, particularly in elite sport, for a long time. And I think that one of the biggest things that hinders us as well, because we have this island mentality, we are very poor speakers of foreign languages. We don't travel well, the English and the British by extension. But I think one of the things that has really hindered the development of young English players is their reluctance to go abroad. So whereas we see quite a significant influx of foreign players coming into English leagues, we still see a very small number of English players playing outside of Europe. And obviously the current example of a player who's spent the majority of his early part of his career abroad is Jadon Sancho. But then you've got those other players who tend to go later in their careers. So your Beckhams, your Bales, Joe Cole at Lille. So players such as that. So I think if English players, and there are more probably, I think, than people appreciate abroad, but if more English players operated with their mentality that if an opportunity isn't available in England, it might be available somewhere else, then that would improve potentially the scope of opportunity that young English players have.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that that's the case. I mean, over recently, as you said, you've got Sancho. I know you've got Bellingham, who's gone out. You had Ampadu. You've got Lookman, Sessegnon. So I'm hoping that more young players, rather than playing in 23s, will look at that as a possible avenue and go out and try and play in Bundesliga or whatever that is. Listen, last question. This is going to be a bit more of a tricky one to what I normally ask people, which is who's the best kind of player or coach they work with. Obviously, within your role, it's a bit different. So I ask you, who's the person within sport or football that you've come across that has most inspired you, and why?
Wow. That is a really, really tricky one. I mean, I've been very fortunate in the course of my career to work with some fantastic people. And you know what? I'm going to skip this one because I don't think there is anyone. I wouldn't want to give primacy to any one particular individual who I think has, who has probably inspired me. Interestingly, and maybe this is something to do with my background as a basketball player, but I often look at the American sports franchises as those which sort of set the lead, set the tone, if you want. And I think often if you look at European leagues and the Premier League, I put in this, that often they are replicas, if you want, of those models, those US models pre-existing, be it NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, National Hockey League. And whilst they obviously operate in slightly different, within slightly different parameters, often the sort of the models on which those leagues are based are American ones. And I look, therefore, as a basketball player at people like David Stern, who was the former commissioner of the NBA. David Stern was somebody who took the NBA from, it was a real mess back in the 1970s, to one of the biggest and most highly respected global sports entities anywhere in the world. He was helped, I should say, along the way by a period of some of the most incredible players at any one point in time. Certainly my athletic hero, if you want, and probably somebody that people will be far more familiar with now if they watched The Last Dance on Netflix. But my hero growing up was always Michael Jordan. But also Phil Jackson, of course, the coach in that Chicago Bulls team, who then went on also to coach the Lakers and so on. I think he is those kind of people are the people that I sort of kind of take my lead from, because they are, I think, the pioneers, if you want. Often replicated in different kind of environments, and I think there's quite a lot that can be learned from people like that.
I was hoping you were going to say Greg Popovich, but I'll let you off. So Richard, listen, I really appreciate obviously giving up a lot of your time. Some really insightful and great conversation now, which I'm sure will be useful to a lot of people. And hopefully we can do this again at some point, because I know there's loads more that we haven't even discussed.
It's been fantastic to speak to you, Michael. And thanks very much.
Cheers. Speak to you soon. Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.